morning, church. Hope you're having a great day. Appreciate you tuning in and catching our devotional series on joy, going through the book of Philippians. And I hope it's a blessing to you. Been going through and looking at just various aspects of joy as Paul is writing this letter from the worst place you can imagine, one of the worst places you can imagine. It's in prison, and writing on joy. And so we've been dealing with this first chapter here over the last several devotionals that we've had, looking at different verses here. And yesterday we got into talking about really just the main idea of the chapter, and looking at circumstances, and Paul dealing with his circumstances, and not allowing the circumstances to crush him and to defeat him, but seeing them really from the eyes of the Lord. And he didn't look at Christ through the circumstances. Rather, he looked at his circumstances through Christ, through a godly perspective. And there really is a difference in a point of view there. And it's very easy to default to the idea of interpreting who God is based on what I'm going through, or thinking that God is a particular way based on what I'm currently experiencing. We all kind of have that tendency, but that's not an accurate picture of who God is, and that's not an accurate picture of what God is doing, because we're just limited in what we can see. And so it definitely takes a spiritual mindset, and as we talked about yesterday, a singular mindset, looking at things and keeping priority. And one of the things about Paul is that we know he had a heart to go and preach the gospel in Rome. He didn't start the church in Rome, but he had a heart to go to Rome and to preach to the people there. And we read that in Acts 19, where he says, after I have been there, talking about Jerusalem, I must also see Rome. And he had a heart to go there. And Romans 1 even tells the church in Rome, so as much as in me is, I'm ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. He wanted to get there as a preacher. Unfortunately, he got there as a prisoner. And many would look at this as a failure. And this was not Paul's plan. This wasn't how he wanted to go there. But Paul didn't let that be a setback to him. And he recognized that, okay, this is what God has allowed. He brought me here a different way. My plan was not God's plan, and that's okay. And that's not an easy place to get to as a Christian, realizing that our plans don't always coincide with God's plans. But I have to learn to rest in God, what God has for me, and rest in God's ways of doing things and his plans for my life, how he wants to use me. Really, that resonates here in verse 12. And verse 12 really is kind of the key to this section here, where he says, but I would you should understand, brethren, that the things which happened unto me have fallen out rather under the furtherance of the gospel. That word furtherance really is the word that gets focused in on here. The word focus the furtherance in verse 12, it means a pioneering advance. It means to cut into new territory, or to cut a new path into territory, into a particular area. David Livingstone in Africa, going into the different tribes that had never been reached with the gospel before. It's kind of how my mind goes to, is he's literally carving through the jungles to get to these villages to be able to preach the gospel to them. That's kind of the imagery of this. But whether or not you and I are taking a machete and cutting down vines to go through a jungle to get somewhere, or if we're just finding new avenues in which to serve, that really is the idea here. God uses the things in our lives to open up new areas of ministry and new ways of getting the gospel to people. I certainly can attest to that. Many of you have heard my testimony of how God used baseball in my life. Not that I was ever a baseball player per se, but that through allowing me to coach baseball, God opened up doors of opportunity for me to get the gospel to different people that I never would have met otherwise. And that was God furthering the gospel, opening up avenues for me by different things. Eventually that would lead to missions down the road, but I didn't know that at the time. I'm just following what the Lord had for me. But Paul here is looking at his circumstances, and instead of feeling confined by these new circumstances, being in prison in Rome, he looks at him and he sees that his circumstances have opened up new areas of ministry for him. He said, how in the world would that be possible? Well, for one, the biggest one is that He was going to be able to stand before Nero, and he would be able to witness to the most powerful man on the planet, because he was going to have to give his defense for why he was in prison, why he was arrested. And certainly in his defense, like he did in other places when he had to stand before officials, he was going to present the gospel. Here's why I'm here. I'm here because of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so God was going to give him a very unique opportunity to preach the gospel, present the gospel to people. Not only that, he was able to witness to all of the guards that were watching him. And we're going to get to that in a second, in a little bit. But he saw his circumstances as opportunities to be a witness. Now, I don't know where you are. I don't know what you're doing, what you're involved in, what kind of job you have. It's very easy to get discouraged in a particular job. You feel like, oh, I'm in a dead-end job. There's nothing here. Maybe in a monetary sense, that may be true. But just understand, if you're saved and you're a child of God, God has you where you are for a reason, even if it's just for a small time. He has you there for something, and he wants you to be an impact in the people's lives around you. And you need to be able to see your circumstances through that lens. God wants us to be pioneers with the gospel. Doesn't mean you have to get on a boat and go across the world, but there's pioneering that needs to be done right here. There's different ways of reaching people and different aspects. I remember when COVID hit and we had all the crazy shutdowns, and 2020 was just an insane year with a lot of just changes, and people had different reactions to things, and nobody wanted anybody knocking on their doors. And we were faced with, what are we going to do? How are we going to get the gospel to people? We still have a responsibility to preach the gospel to people. So what are we going to do? And appreciate getting the idea together of putting a door hanger together to go out and just tag doors with a door hanger that still had the church information on it and even had the streaming information. And we're able to reach people in a different way. Wasn't the primary way I would have wanted to do it, but it was at least something to be able to find a way to get the message of Christ to people, give an avenue of ministry there, just looking for opportunities, looking for ways to get it done. That's what God wants. God wants us being kind of innovative in how we're looking at things. Whatever your job is at, try to find ways to be a witness on the job site. Maybe it's at a break, or maybe it's in conversation and your coworkers and say, hey, I know you go to church. My mother's sick right now. Would you mind praying? Or something like that opens up opportunities for you to be a witness. But God wants us to be able to see our circumstances that fall to us as not just setbacks, not just things that we have to endure. I have to get through this. Well, while you're getting through it, try to make something with it. Try to do something with it. Don't just make it, well, this is a stage of life that I just have to be in. Oh, well, that's kind of miserable. If I have to be somewhere, I want to try to enjoy it as much as I can. Now, I understand sometimes you're limited on how much joy you can get out of something. But one way that certainly will produce the joy of the Lord is if you can learn to look at whatever circumstances you're dealing with as some tool that God has put in your hand to be able to get the gospel to people. That was Paul's mentality here, that these things that happened unto him, the things that he's been through and that have happened unto him, have fallen out rather unto the furtherance of the gospel. That word rather is important. He says, rather than me looking negatively at them, which would have been very easy to do, he looked at them as opportunity to serve. And so I want to challenge you today, as you're going out to work, going to school, whatever you're doing, I want to challenge you to look for opportunities, whatever God has put in your hand to do. Try to find a way to use it to be an influence for Christ. And I promise you, if you'll do that, it might not turn out the way you think it's going to do, but the more you do it, the more you're going to realize God's given your heart some joy just for stepping into that vein. And God wants to give us the joy of the Lord, and this is a great way to do it. So hope you have a wonderful day. May God bless.